marginally better off. And in fact, from 1970 to the present, the normal person doesn't get better off at all.
Joel Rogers and I wrote a book called Right Turn, where we sort of walk through the remaking of the Democratic Party in the 1980s. Effectively, the business Democrats run the basic modern Democratic Party. That was what Clinton, and for that matter Al Gore, and those people were all about. That's what all the subsequent Democratic Party candidates thus far have been to, including the current president. The folks who created this crisis are, to a very large measure, the folks who principally financed the Obama campaign. That's to say, this guy is first and foremost a candidate of finance. I mean, you hear all these government Sachs jokes about Goldman Sachs. No reason to pick on them. That'd be unfair. Morgan Stanley, Bank of America. There's a big raft of hedge funds and investment houses. They dominate the early financing among large investors for Obama. I suspect to this day you'll find that the majority Democrat, the firms that continuously contribute to the Democrats in big numbers are still, at least vestigially, more capital intensive. But obviously the big story in the 1970s and after, it's first of all the enormous role finance takes, and then the harshness. As I said, in the private equity case of the 90s, you could see inside finance folks like Kohlberg, Kravis, and Roberts. Those folks, when they get into the business of running companies, and where your basic scheme is buy a company, grab the pension fund, pull the assets, as much assets of that out as you can, put it in the rest of the firm, bust up the firm, sell it, and things like that, and also fire a lot of people to pay down debt. That's, in fact, what seems often to happen in these takeovers. At that point, you're beginning to act like a sort of classic capitalist. What you've got there is you'll often find these folks at very antagonistic to labor, and a lot of the folks in you get an almost 19th century approach to labor management confrontation.
We turn now to a labor struggle here in New York. More than 130 workers at the Stella d'Oro Biscuit Company in the Bronx have ended an 11-month strike. The workers returned to their jobs on Wednesday, a week after the National Labor Relations Board ordered the company to reinstate and pay back wages to the striking workers. The employees at Stella d'Oro walked off their job last August after company officials tried to force them to accept a 20% pay cut, elimination of sick days and overtime, reductions in vacations and holidays, and an increase in employee health care contributions. While the Stella d'Oro workers have returned to their jobs, their fight isn't over. The company's owner, the Connecticut-based private equity fund Brynwood Partners, is now threatening to close the factory within 90 days.
It was a family-run company for many, many years, and then they got sold to corporate owners, first Nabisco, and then Nabisco got bought by Kraft. So Kraft was the owner that sold it to the private equity company. So when they say it's not profitable, they really don't mean it's not profitable. They mean we don't get the super rates of profit that we expect. These folks tell their investors that they're going to return a 30 to 35% rate of return. That is an unreasonable rate of return. They're not an operating company. They're a financial investor. They're only going to keep it for 3 to 5 years, and they're going to turn it around. So their whole point was to reduce labor costs to the point where they could get another buyer to come in and have a contract that was gutted. Some of it was financial and some of it was issues of control, not just financial. Like one of the provisions in this contract, it's an old kind of, if people know CIO, it's an old industrial contract. We have a provision that says that the cookies will have union labels on them. So that was one of their proposals, to take off the union labels from the packaging. Now that doesn't save them any money. It's just an issue of who's controlling what.
I try organizing in one of the U.S. client states in Latin America. You can get your brains blown out. In Colombia, for example.
The relationship between the United States and Colombia has been extremely strong. We've had great cooperation on a whole range of issues, and President Uribe's administration, I think, has, under very difficult circumstances, performed admirably on a whole range of fronts, on security, in improving the economic situation for his people, and stabilizing the country. He has performed with diligence and courage, and so we are grateful for his friendship. We've discussed most prominently the interests of both countries in moving forward on a free trade agreement.
This has to do with a fact that was mentioned by Edward Herman and Noam Chomsky in their book, the Washington Connection and Third World Fascism, namely, that what is sought in the Third World is a favorable climate of investment. This means imposing authoritarian measures to undermine unions, welfare programs, and governments that may use the resources of a country for its own people, rather than giving preference to the open-door policies sought by foreign investors. In fact, Chomsky and Herman established a double correlation: the more favorable the investment climate, the more human rights violations and U.S. aid increased. The evidence presented in their later book, Manufacturing Consent, proves that this favorable investment climate was supported by the corporate media. This was done by whitewashing crimes and corrupt elections in third world countries that were subordinate to foreign investors, while attacking governments resisting foreign exploitation.
Well, you can get the JP to swear out peace bonds, or you can heist the bail high enough to keep him in jail.
Keep him? What am I supposed to do? Feed him out of my own pocket?
What I want to know, Mr. Hartwell, is when are you going to settle this thing? You won't negotiate with him? What do you want anyway?
Company has other minds. You've got to see the larger picture. Once these people get out of hands,
America smashed this place with big bombs. More than 2 million tons in the time of the Vietnam War, which is more than what was dropped by all of the Allies together during the whole of the Second World War. So Laos has a huge, large bomb problem, and they lose a lot of people every year. Since the war ended, in excess of 12,000 people have been killed or injured by bombs or other remnants of war. 30% of these items didn't explode and remain live today. But in many areas, it's near impossible to farm. People blow themselves up whilst cultivating the land. This has kept people poor, and you know the new cash crop now, I suppose, is scrap metal.
The Cold War, in effect, was a war of the United States against the Third World and of Russia against its much smaller domains in Eastern Europe. Each great power used the other's threats as a pretext.
The major objectives in Vietnam are pretty much what they were in Cuba, Guatemala, Nicaragua, Congo, all around the world. They were afraid that Vietnam was going to undergo successful social and economic development, and as it's put in high places, the rot might spread to others. It might lead to ideological victories for the mode of socioeconomic development that they're pursuing. The virus might infect others, as Kissinger put it with regard to Chile. Well, when you have a virus, what do you do with it? You kill the virus and you inoculate the potential victims, and that's what happened. Indochina was killed. Not going to, maybe it'll survive, but it's not going to be a model for anything. And the surrounding region was inoculated. In the 60s and early 70s, the U.S. succeeded in installing brutal and vicious military dictators in every country, and that prevented the rot from spreading.
After World War II, you would be involved in some international political adventure. Now, when you studied the roots of some of these, you came quickly to the conclusion that this is really about American business abroad. Maybe it's, they don't want to be nationalized, or they weren't, or something. And so we're supporting a government somewhere. This is directed toward some economic objective here. You had folks making decisions where there was a perceived risk of a nuclear exchange for what is in effect an interest that, I wouldn't call a vital interest of anybody except the corporations involved. I myself ran a study of intervention, and what I did was take the known cases of U.S. troops that had been dispatched abroad, and I used a Library of Congress study, and then I combined a number of databases and added some. Got that out, and what I discovered was pretty interesting. It was that the tendency to intervention under Clinton didn't change at all from the rate under Reagan and Bush. I mean, what you basically saw was a big, steep increase in interventions after World War II, a leveling off in the early 70s, as the sort of reaction to Vietnam, the Vietnam set in. And then, under the Reagan doctrine in the early 80s, it just takes off like a rocket.
There was trouble in the land of Nicaragua in the 80s, it's true. And Uncle Sam has always said this kind of thing just really won't do. So he paid for a bag full of dirty tricks and turned killers into heroes with a PR blitz. Well, freedom's sure a funny word for what the Contras did do. You know, there are pirates and emperors, but they're really the same thing. Even the ones who say they just want to let freedom ring, well, they do it big or they do it small, but only one goes down when they break the law, while the big one claims
this really don't apply to me. Clinton did not change the slope of that. I mean, he was busily intervening about as often. On the other hand, I would have to say that I rather doubt the Democrats would have invaded Iraq in the same direct, blunt way that the Republicans did.
I don't understand why this keeps happening to me.
Well, not so long ago we thought Saddam here was a pretty swell guy, and we helped him get the goods to make the Ayatollah Khomeini cry. But Uncle Sam decided it was not Saddam's fate to be the leader of his Middle Eastern client state that was sitting on top of a big, huge oil supply.
In AFPAC, Afghanistan, Pakistan, as the region's now called, Obama is building enormous new embassies and other facilities on the model of the city within a city in Baghdad. These are like no embassies anywhere in the world, and they are signs of an intention to be there for a long time. He's also, as you know, sharply escalating the AFPAC war. Obama's pressing the Iraqi government not to permit the referendum that's required by the Status of Forces Agreement. Washington's current objection to the referendum was explained 2 days ago by New York Times correspondent Alyssa Rubin. Obama fears that the Iraqi population might reject the provision that delays U.S. troop withdrawal.
There's no question, these are all businesses. They share pretty fully in the sort of conviction that private property ought to be pretty absolute. You can see that even in some of the responses to the healthcare debates. President Obama was talking at the Business Council, and he was asked by one of the large firm heads there about medical care. I noticed, hey, that's a relatively capital-intensive firm. And this guy was clearly railing on at the prospect of the one serious reform